Martha. Good morning, everybody. Well, we can get started. We have a substitute speaker this morning, which I'm really excited about. We have Brianna Elene from the Wisconsin Council of Churches. Our Peder Johanson had a grandparent of a spouse pass away, and so he had to go out of state for her funeral. And Brianna stepped up on short notice, for which I'm immensely grateful. And she's going to kind of give us an update on the Wisconsin Council of Churches and their work, and particularly the Afghan resettlement work that they were very involved in late last year and early this year. So thank you, and thanks for getting the handout. And I'll turn over the floor to Brianna. Welcome.
All righty. So as you all know, I'm the pinch hitter, so you have to be kind and generous with me. I also, so in the back, there is a handout. For those of you online, it looks like she already dropped it in the link or in the chat. And then those of you in person, there are also some goodies. I said, when you get the person who handles some of the marketing at the council, I bring goodies to bribe you all when you're not getting Peder. So there's some pens and some stickers, and feel free to grab those on your way out. So a little bit about myself. I am the Content Curation and Ecumenical Innovation Coordinator, which is a very long title. It means content curation means I do kind of our marketing. I do all our social media, our e-newsletters. I make posters, I make t-shirts, I do all kinds of stuff. And then ecumenical innovation, the other part of my job, is a fun part. And I often, when I even started at the council, I would say my title, I'm the Content Curation Ecumenical Innovation Coordinator. I'd say, I do my little spiel about content curation, and then I'd say, what do you think ecumenical innovation is? Because I don't know. But what it has looked like is stepping in or paying attention to what God is doing in our world and asking, how can the church step into that? How can I, as someone at the Wisconsin Council of Churches, facilitate churches like yours, churches like so many others who want to help out, who know there are needs in our communities? How can we step into that? And what do we need to do? And so one of the things that looked like was the Afghan refugee crisis. I kind of started a lot of that work. So if you would have asked me in September or November or December, I would have been like 100% on this. So I know a lot. And Peder and I work really closely together. So you're not getting someone who knows nothing. But yeah, and so I stepped in and said, this is a need. This is something that's happening. A little bit of the story of Peder's position is last September, when we were kind of seeing what was happening on the news, we said, I talked to Carrie Parker, my boss, our executive director, and she said, hey, like churches want to help out. We see this thing happening. Churches want to do something. Can you spend some time helping to curate some resources, figure out what's happening, what's going on? And I said, sure. And I started to ask some questions. I attended a few meetings, and I asked her, and I said, Carrie, how long should I be spending on this work? Because there's only so many hours in my workday. And she said, go for about 5 hours a week. I mean, this is a big deal. This is something churches really want to be involved in. Try to spend 5 hours a week figuring out what's happening. So I started and spent 5 hours a week, and then it seemed to be 6 and 7 and 8. And there were weeks I ended up spending 20 or 25 hours a week because we realized that the situation was really complex. There was a point that probably in, I don't know, September or November, things were really messy. I was sitting in these meetings. We heard that there were these huge volunteer needs, and that we knew we had churches of people who wanted to volunteer. And so I was trying to figure out what was happening. How can we get people up to Fort McCoy, which is where a lot of Afghan refugees were being housed? How can we get people up there to volunteer? And I reached out to the United Way of Wisconsin. because they are a statewide organization. They do lots of stuff. And I said, United Way, you should know what's going on. And so we sat down, we zoomed into a meeting and we were talking. And I said, these are all the things I know. I know about this, I know about that. And then we kind of got done and I said, well, what do you guys know? And they looked at me and they said, Brianna, the Wisconsin Council of Churches knows far more than we know. Can we keep meeting? Because you know things. But for me, it was a big eye-opening moment to say, this is really complex. This is really hard. That it was a statewide effort to talk about Afghan refugee resettlement. And so I did that for a while, and we realized that there was so much happening. We realized there were so many needs happening. We realized the church was really passionate about it. And so we did some fundraising, and we're able to fundraise a whole position, who's Peder, and hire him on to continue some of this work for the next year or two, because we know it's a need and we know the church wants to step up and we know the situation is really complex. So then once we hired Peder, I was like, all right, what's my next project? And I've wandered off to other things. So that tells you a little bit about my role in it. I will give you a little bit about the Wisconsin Council of Churches too, and then we'll get into some more details on Afghan refugee resettlement. So the Wisconsin Council of Churches is an ecumenical organization. And here's your pop quiz of the day. Who knows what ecumenical means? Oh, I like that image. Close. It's got the inter, but it's Christian only. So you get interfaith, and we're like the Christian version of that. So it's the same ideas, but it's the coming together of the church. One of the things that we do as the Wisconsin Council of Churches is we work and we pray for the unity of the church. And so sometimes that looks like sitting around and saying, well, what do Catholics and Lutherans and Methodists and Presbyterians, what do we all agree on? And sometimes we'll write statements and do kind of these like really theological things. Sometimes it looks like there's an Afghan refugee crisis. Let's all come together. Let's pool our money together, hire somebody to help fill in some of these gaps, and then say, how can we help bring in Catholics and Presbyterians and Methodists and Lutherans to do this work together? I was just sharing with Emily that at the start of 2021, so like a little over a year ago, we had 3 staff. We currently have, it's either 11 or 12 staff. We have grown a lot in the last year, 2 years. Kind of when COVID hit, we started doing a lot of COVID guidance. I don't know if your church used that at all, but helping churches figure out how do we navigate this pandemic, and actually became nationally known for some of our guidance. I had colleagues out, there's a pastor here in Madison who moved from Georgia. And when she moved to Madison, her church said, oh, we're using the Wisconsin Council of Churches COVID guidance. And she said, great, because my church in Georgia was using that too. Awesome. I know about this stuff. And so we've had this big reach. And so with that, along with some of our guidance, we have actually gotten some grants from the Department of Health and are doing a lot of COVID vaccine outreach. We have on the ground organizers in Milwaukee, in Rib Lake, which is like up north, the Milwaukee suburbs, and then someone in Fond du Lac who are helping to organize clinics to get more people vaccinated, helping to say, what does it mean to navigate this pandemic in a safer way? So we do COVID stuff. We have people working on advocacy, asking what does it mean to be down at the Capitol, to have a Christian voice, make sure that the Lutherans and the Methodists and the Presbyterians and the Catholics have a Christian voice at the Capitol. A lot of our advocacy leans into talking about hunger, to talking about, I think of what we've been doing, a lot of voting rights stuff. We've got a whole voting rights project. So making sure that we represent that voice. And then our most recent person who joined our staff is doing a lot with kind of church support, church leader support. Throughout the pandemic, it has been a very hard time for churches. The number of pastors who are leaving their calls because they are tired, because they've navigated conflict, they've navigated change. Church leaders, then kind of that next level down, maybe the people who are on staff or aren't on staff are tired. They've been navigating a lot of conflict. They've been navigating a lot of change. How do we help support leaders? And so Reverend Libby Howe has stepped in, and she is helping to think through that. How do we help get back? One of the things she talks about is getting from the boxing ring into the baptismal font. What are we called to as Christians? How do we root into that? So that is your very super quick overview of the Wisconsin Council of Churches. We lean into the ideas of courage, of justice, and of holy imagination. Those are kind of our values, to say, okay, where in the world do we need to step in? What is God doing? How can we work for justice? Where do we, as the church, need some courage? And what is the holy imagination that God has called us to imagine God's kingdom, to work for God's kingdom? And so we do a whole bunch of things, and I could talk to you for days about it. So if you have questions, I did throw my contact information on the handout. And then I also included Peder, who specifically works on Afghan refugee resettlement. So we're going to move a little bit into that. One of the things that we are currently a project we are currently working on that your church has actually been a part of is I think about 10 to 15 years ago, put out a study guide. One of the things we do are study guides to help churches talk about different issues. We had a study guide about immigration, and we looked at it, I think this was pre-pandemic, so like 2019-ish, and said, it's time to update this. The world has changed, conversation about immigration has changed. It's time to update this. And your church actually helped provide some of the funds for us to have we had a woman who was a refugee, who was a student at, I think, UW Milwaukee, maybe Madison, I forget where she was, who was actually a refugee from Burma. And she helped to do some of this work. And then now we're in the continuing process of coming up with a study guide, or rewriting this study guide to reflect the current state of immigration in Wisconsin. And so I was going through that and some of the work we're working on, and pulled out some of the biblical foundations. We don't do this work because we're really nice people. We do this work because it is what God has called us to do. And in Leviticus 19, 33 to 34 says, when a foreigner resides among you in your land, do not mistreat them. The foreigner residing among you must be treated as your native born. Love them as yourself. For you were foreigners in Egypt. I am the Lord your God. There are stories of immigrants and people being refugees all throughout the Bible. I did a Google search and pulled something up. The United Church of Christ had they have a really great list, and it was super long, of all the places where immigration and refugees and people, kind of foreign-born people, are mentioned in the Bible. And it is a long, long list. And so I'm gonna get y'all thinking a little bit. And those of you online are also welcome to type in answers to this. We'll read them out if you guys can help if you see someone type an answer in. Who are the immigrants in the Bible? What are the stories of immigration? Yeah. Exactly. The Israelites were immigrants to Canaan, and there are so many stories of the Israelite people moving around. There are, yep, He was not the first, but he was on my list. He's the third, but that was one of the first ones I thought of, was Abraham and Sarah, the Israelite people.
We have Hebrews, we have Ruth, we have Abraham online.
Are you Googling? Oh, people are. Oh, no.
I'm reading,
I thought you were
no, I'm
Googling.
not
I was like, hold
Googling.
on a minute.
No, I was reading the chat for you.
Thank you. Yeah,
Yeah.
Ruth. I didn't have Ruth on my list, but she definitely moved around. How did I forget Ruth? This is why we need a community and a group of people. Yeah.
Well, what about each of the two? I'm trying to think. Judah and Israel.
Mhm.
When people are taken into slavery, are they considered immigrants?
I
Are they considered refugees? Are they considered captives?
if you think about when, I'm not sure which one you're talking about, if you're thinking about the when they went down to Egypt
Well, but also to
or the Babylonian
the
exile.
Babylonian. Mhm.
Yeah, I wrote that down.
Mhm.
I've been doing a lot of thinking about the Babylonian exile because it's people who've been exiled out. It
Right.
felt like that with COVID. And I think that is definitely one of the people had to leave.
Mhm.
Their land had been conquered.
Right.
They had to flee to Babylon. But then there's also when the people had to flee to Egypt.
Mhm.
The story of Jacob and Joseph. We always hear the story of Jacob in his technicolor coat, but there was a famine in the land.
Mhm.
So God's people fled to Egypt. They then ended up in slavery, so it didn't end up so well, but it is a story of immigration.
Mhm.
Other stories? Yeah, Mary, Joseph, and Jesus. They had to flee from King Herod because it was not safe when Jesus was a baby. So we also have, so we talked about Jacob and Joseph and going to Egypt. There was also the coming out of Egypt. Lot, and he fled the city of Sodom. And these are two I did not think of, but the internet told me, and I was like, these are actually really interesting to think about. But the story of Adam and Eve, they were in a garden and they migrated out. And then the story of Noah, he had to get on a boat. And I mean, there wasn't, at first he didn't know where he was going, but he got on a boat and ended up in a new place. So the story of immigrants is at the core of our stories as Christians. And that is really important, I think, for us to remember. So when we talk about immigration, or refugees, there is often kind of three phases of immigration, three phases of migration. There is a pre-migration stage. Someone is in their country of origin and something happens that they look around and they say, this is not safe anymore. Or maybe I need to go over there. There is something that pushes them to say that I'm ready to leave. And sometimes it is war. Sometimes it's hunger. Sometimes it's violence. Sometimes it's that they fall in love and they're partners from another country. It's not all bad reasons, but there are reasons that people look around and say, this place is no longer my home. And so they pack up their stuff. And again, sometimes it's I'm going to pack stuff slowly. I'm going to leave. I'm going to make a plan. Sometimes they look around and they say, oh my gosh, I need to leave now. And they're out. Every story is different. So the first phase is pre-migration. The second phase is migration. It is the process of actually traveling. Again, that looks really different. For some people, that is, I got on an airplane, I flew to my home, the next country, I'm done. For other people, this process takes years. They flee to a second country, but that's not where they're going to finally end up, but they spend years in that country. Sometimes it's in refugee camps. Sometimes it's in a couple different countries. Sometimes they really get settled down. Sometimes it's just a time of instability. And then the final phase is post-migration. It is you have arrived in your new home. And that is a whole process that involves learning a new culture. It involves sometimes learning a new language, learning what is my role in this life, because maybe it looks really different. There is a lot of complexity. And if you think about it, each of those phases have a lot of complexity. And so there are organizations that work with people at each of those phases. So now let's put this into context. August of 2021, Afghanistan. This kind of the US pulling out of Afghanistan was something that people knew was coming. They'd been talking about it. The US was going to pull out. And now I am not a war, military, political science expert. But we all know it did not go as planned. You're gonna have to get someone who really knows things to tell you why, but it did not go as planned. Some of the conversations I had with some of the folks working in a refugee resettlement, they had been told people were coming. They said, prepare yourselves. We know that there are all these people in Afghanistan who've been working as US allies, US partners. We know there are these people that when we leave, Afghanistan will not be safe for them. So you need to start preparing refugee resettlement agencies. You are going to have all these people, a lot of people, over the next 18 months. Well, all of a sudden, 18 months condensed into 2 weeks. And people were flown out of the country. We all saw those photos of people just kind of rushing to the bases, trying to be evacuated. And at this point, people were evacuees, because part of the US immigration system, the US refugee system, is there is a process. Refugees are highly vetted. There's a process where you have to undergo all kinds of background checks. You have to meet with people. You have to get visas. You have to do all of this work that often happens so we talked about the pre-migration, the migration, post-migration stage. That happens in that middle stage. People have fled their country to a second country. That is where this process takes place. And it takes, I think I've heard about often, I think minimum it takes a year, maybe, often a lot longer. You have to get on lists, you have to make plans, and then you get to come to the United States under a refugee visa. People in Afghanistan, that did not happen. People went from pre-migration stage to post-migration. One of the things, I had a conversation with someone from Lutheran Social Services in Milwaukee, and that's an organization we've done a lot of work with. They are the biggest refugee resettlement organization in Wisconsin. They talked about the trauma that happens at each stage of migration. There is trauma when you are in your home and need to leave. When you are looking around and your world is falling apart, when you realize your home is not safe, there is trauma that happens there. There is trauma that happens in the migration stage. When you are spending years in a refugee camp, there is trauma. And then when you are settled in a new place that maybe you didn't want to leave and you don't actually want to live in this new country, there is trauma. Even if you're excited to be in the new country, there is trauma. And there was some conversation about what happens, because people have navigated this, there's kind of these different traumas that happen. What happens when you skip the whole second stage? When you just go from I've left to I'm in this new place. So about 65,000 people were evacuated from Afghanistan over a 2-week period. About 49,000 of those people were placed at 8 US military bases. So what actually happened is the migration phase happened on US soil, but these US military bases almost began to operate as refugee camps. This is not what the US military wanted. They are like, this is not what we do. All of a sudden, there were all these people in these bases. Here in Wisconsin, there was and the numbers were always shifting and changing, sometimes because more people would come, sometimes because people would leave, but there was as many as 13,000. What Peder has. I feel like I might have also read 16,000. 16,000, 13,000 people were at Fort McCoy in Wisconsin. I want you to think about that. Does anyone know a town of that size? Here's your like Wisconsin geography. And I did not look this up, so I should have been a little more prepared. But I know when I was talking about this before, I did something down in Mount Horeb. And Mount Horeb, I think, has 7,000 people. And I said, just imagine 2 of your town plopped almost overnight onto a military base. Think about the complexity of that. That many people. There was a statistic I heard early on that said that there were 30 babies a month being born at Fort McCoy. Think about how many diapers that is. Think about how much formula that is. Think about how much clothing that is. And this was Fort McCoy in the US military and the organizations they contracted with, they were not used to doing this kind of work, but they had to scramble. So when I tell you that story in the beginning of the complexity, it's because it happened so fast and it was so large. I sat in some of these meetings and there were days that I sat there and I was like, why am I in this room? I like could do I've done a clothing drive before. I've like done a food drive and gathered like 500 pounds of food, but that would feed like a little tiny corner for not even a day. Because I sat on these phone calls with St. Vincent de Paul who were talking about like bringing semi-loads full of stuff because people needed stuff. People needed clothing, bedding, all of these things because most of them had nothing. So one of the agencies that we connected with at the council was Catholic Charities of La Crosse. They are an so if you think of Lutheran Social Services, they are like the Catholic version of that. Catholic Charities, I think they do many similar things. They run, I think up in La Crosse, they run a homeless shelter. I think they may do adoption stuff like LSS. Like refugee resettlement is not actually something they do. Coordinating 15,000 Afghan refugees is not something they do, but they stepped up and said, okay, let's figure out how to do this. And so they were one of many organizations who came in, and their mission was morale, wellness, and recreation. This is a little bit speaking to that trauma. People have been traumatized. Everything's been thrown up. How can we help care for people's spirits and souls a little bit? This is not from an evangelism point. There were, I think, some chaplains who were helping to create some space on base for prayer. 99% of people from Afghanistan are Muslim. There was a lot of we did have a conversation with a chaplain who said that there was some work around helping people know that it was safe to practice their faith, because they had this image of the United States that was very Christian, and they didn't know if they were even allowed to pray, if they were allowed to practice who they were as Christian or as Muslims. And so the chaplains were doing some of that work, but it also was like, how do we help care for people's spirits? And so we were able to help recruit volunteers, and it took a very long time, but your pastor was actually one who went up and volunteered at the MWR centers. And so there were kind of 3 types of centers happening. There were sewing centers for women, because one of the things that folks learned when working with people from Afghanistan is like many of the women who are Afghan know how to sew, like to sew. They don't actually want a little short dress like I'm wearing. They don't want jeans. They want clothing that they're used to, and they are used to sewing their own clothing. And so it was actually, this is me very much making things up, but I would imagine that like they actually preferred getting fabric and saying, let's sew clothing that we like and we know, rather than going to digging through these bins to get some clothing that doesn't actually look like what we want and what we're used to. So they had 2 different sewing centers set up that would say, okay, you can come and you can sew, you can mend. And let me tell you, again, imagine you've got a city of 15,000 people, 10,000 people. That's a lot of people. There was this whole process of having to figure out, how do we make sure that everyone gets in, that there's enough fabric. It was this constant kind of navigating to make rules that were fair for everyone. I visited up to Fort McCoy on the day I was there. Beth, who is the Catholic Charities woman coordinator, had taken me around, and we stopped at the sewing center, and she spent a good like 45 minutes navigating conflict. Because these are people who are traumatized. These are people who are just trying to survive, who don't really know, like they're not home, they're not in their houses. They're being told by these other people that you only get to use the sewing machine for a little bit. And so there was a lot of navigating to say, let's be in conversation, let's be in relationship. So there was sewing centers. There were they set up a couple of big, I think they were like airplane hangars originally. I don't know. There were these big buildings that they put like soccer balls, and people could go in and play soccer because winter came and it got real cold. So people had to go indoors. And there were some game rooms, and they were like really loud recreation centers. And then there were a lot of children. I think, I didn't write this down, but I feel like at one point I was told that like half of the people up there were children. And so they had children's centers. And for our volunteers who went up there, I volunteered for like an hour in one of these, or an afternoon. It was a children's and women's center. And so the women could go and like gather together in kind of a safe space. They often taught English, or were learning English. And so when I was there, the women wanted to know how to go to the store. And so they were practicing phrases. What do you need to know when you go to the store? And then on the other half was a children's center, and there'd be like 50 to 100 children who would come in, and it was pure chaos. If you can imagine 50 to 100 children in a small room, and they usually would be a craft or some games and try to just keep kids entertained. And then there were a couple of schools that were also set up. And so there was I think like a kind of elementary school and a high school-ish. And they, like, not everyone went to school. Part of it was values. Maybe your kid, like you were from a more rural place and your kids wouldn't have gone to school. Maybe it was parents said, you know what? We are in this migration temporary stage. School is really hard right now. We're going to pause. We'll deal with that later. Also, they're just probably, if every kid had wanted to go to school, and it was slightly more structured. It wasn't a school. It was, let's divide the kids by age and do some English lessons with them. Many of this was often taught by volunteers. There was a big need. We talked a lot about the need to humanize people. When you have that many people, how do you help humanize them? How do you know that they are people with a story? It was amazingly complex because everything was often changing. We would hear about a need and say, okay, let's see if we could organize something. And by the time we organized, maybe figured something out, something would shift, something would change. These people would be in charge. And then all of a sudden, these people were in charge. Oh, now these people are in charge. And part of that was initially the Red Cross came in. They were the first organization in, as they often are. They know how to deal with people in emergency. But the situation shifted from an emergency to something a little longer term. And the Red Cross said, well, when it's not an emergency, we have to move to the next emergency. There are wildfires. We've got a lot going on too. And so it was just really a complex situation. So meanwhile, you've got all these people on the base. Then there's the resettlement agencies. There is that post-migration stage. The goal is to get people there as fast as possible. No one wants to be up at Fort McCoy. No one wants to be they were living in barracks. It is better than being in Afghanistan, not where you want to be. So resettlement agencies had to scramble. Well, I will tell you that if you were to look at numbers of refugee resettlement over the past 5 years or so, they had dropped immensely. The US was not settling refugees for the last 5 years. I remember seeing articles here, Jewish Social Services, which is the organization in the Madison area that does refugee resettlement. I remember them doing a ton of advocating to say, we have people who want to come, we've filled out the paperwork, but they just couldn't get through the system because things had been shut down. What happens in refugee resettlement when refugees are not being resettled? Their funding gets cut. Resettlement agencies' funding depends on how many people they resettle. And if they aren't resettling people, they don't have funding. And so we had some issues because you all of a sudden have all these people on bases who need to be resettled, and staffs are already really small and underfunded. And so pray for every resettlement agency you know. If you ever meet anyone working in refugee resettlement, just tell them thank you. We know you've been working hard, because many of these folks stepped up and they said, we're going to do this. And I know people who they didn't get vacations and they said, we're just going to do this as fast as we can. There are 6 resettlement agencies in Wisconsin. We're going to test me to see, spend a minute if I can name them all, but Jewish Social Services is in Madison. Lutheran Social Services is in Milwaukee. Institute of, it starts with the word institute. There's another one. I want to say it's like Institute of Resettle. I don't know. But there's one in Milwaukee that does predominantly with students. There is Ethiopian Community Development Association up in Wausau. And then there's one in I think Catholic Charities up in the Fond du Lac, Oshkosh, Fox Valley area. I feel like I might have missed one, but those are generally it. So those are the areas where there are resettlement agencies. There is an agency called Church World Service, and they've been doing some remote resettlement. So they have a national organization, and they will do it. This is the power of technology, that they've been able to do some remote stuff. So they're actually helping to resettle some families in Platteville through this remote option. I wish I'd written down the numbers, but there was a point that Lutheran Social Services was getting like 50 to 60 people a week. If you can imagine, I think they'd done like maybe 100 people a year, and all of a sudden they were getting almost that in a week. Their goal at the beginning of 2021 was to resettle 250 people, because with the change in administration, refugee resettlement was opening back up. So their plan was to resettle 250 people from all over the world. That did not include, it might have included a few people from Afghanistan, but all over the world. They, I think, ended up doing 200 people from Afghanistan on top of it in 2021. And then I think the bulk of the people actually came in January. So So overall, there are 823 people, Afghans, who have arrived in August who've been resettled in Wisconsin. 823. There's an additional 235 Afghans currently housed in military. Oh, there are 235 Afghans currently housed in military bases overseas because people were pulled out. I forget the number I said, 65,000 came, or 49,000 came to US military bases in the US. There are still people who left Afghanistan but are overseas who will come through the process. So they're expecting another 235 Afghani people who are housed outside the US to come to Wisconsin. There are issues around visas because of this process. People have not entered as refugees. They are here under a humanitarian parole visa, and they have 12 months from the date of their arrival to apply for asylum. The asylum process is really complicated. 12 months is probably not enough time. And there's no guarantee that you will get asylum. And so there are some movements at the national level asking for the Afghan Adjustment Act. That is a proposal that would help to fix some of these issues. Right, yeah. There are issues of just the backlog of people applying for asylum. We've also been told that for every Afghan person in the US, there's another 3-4 outside. There are people who are trying to still get their family out of Afghanistan. There are people who came over earlier, people who are Afghan who came over, have gone through the process. This was pre-2021, are now US citizens. One of the things you can then do is apply for your family to come and like bring more people. And like that is part of our process that is allowed, but because of the backlog, everything is being denied and people are not being able to come to the US. So there are just a lot of messy issues. There are still people being resettled. Yeah, I had someone ask about, I'll finish up and then we've got about 15 minutes, I think, for questions. Someone asked about Ukraine. The Biden administration has announced a commitment to receive 100,000 Ukrainian asylum seekers, but it is too early to know how or when they could arrive. Bringing people to the US and resettlement is considered a last resort. We want people to be safe and at home and in their countries. And so there's a hope that a lot of people are hoping to stay in Europe so that they can return home. So we don't really know what that will look like. There are, if you watch the news, there are people coming in, especially at the southern border. There are a lot of people who've flown to Mexico and are coming in, Ukrainians who are coming in. There is a whole conversation we could have about how we are letting Ukrainian people in, but not other people through the Mexican border. But it is messy. It is complicated. So we will wait and see. We will see what happens. I know people really want to help out. And one of the things that we've had, because we've had people reaching out to say, okay, can we help resettle Ukrainian people? Like, we really care about this. We want to help. And we have said, it is a pipeline. And so if you're really passionate about helping Ukrainian people, we need to help Afghani people. And maybe we need to also help people from Sierra Leone or people from Cameroon or people like everyone who gets resettled helps the people behind them, helps these organizations kind of clear that pipeline. So yeah, that is a really fast information download. It is complex. I did include on here a few statistics. There are volunteer opportunities. So Jewish Social Services in Madison is the refugee resettlement agency in here in Madison. And then Open Doors for Refugees is an organization that works with them, and it is phenomenal. They do a lot of collecting goods, I think they have like looking for volunteers to help with transportation. They are always looking for support. Team Rubicon is an organization that has been involved in this work from the beginning. They were up at Fort McCoy helping to like sort through goods. They've now moved into the resettlement phase of helping to like furnish homes. And what we've been told is they have a warehouse in Milwaukee that is closing down, and they are trying to open one in Madison, it sounds like. And so if you were interested in volunteering with them, I put the link on there, and if you go there, it might say Milwaukee, but just you can sign up anyways. And I think there might be a place to put a note and say I'm in Madison, and they can help you do that. Lutheran Social Services is in Milwaukee. And then on the bottom, we have a newsletter that Peder is really good weekly trying to update with what is happening. A lot of the stuff I said about Ukraine all came from his last newsletter. So he's really trying to help communicate a really complex situation. Oh. So are there any questions?
I can bring a mic if people have questions, or if folks on Zoom do, you can unmute yourself or chat and we'll read them out.
And we'll find out if I know the answers or not.
So I imagine there's a subset of Afghans and Ukrainians that have some family somewhere in the US. And is that sort of the default for those people that have some connections like that?
Yeah.
To go to them?
To go, yeah, that was the goal. That was the goal. I know, so in the US for like Afghanistan specifically, a lot of Afghans live in California and Virginia. And when there were 65,000 people, that's where everyone wanted to go. But you can't have that many people go into that space. And so one of the things that LSS said at one point was, a sign of success is actually a refugee family being resettled and moving away, because it means they've got themselves on their feet enough and they are able to move to wherever their family is. So it actually sometimes might be a kind of another migration stage of settling in Wisconsin for a year. And then once things get established, once they are financially able, moving to Virginia or California. So ideally, yes. But when there's this many people, it's impossible. One of the things I forgot to say is one of the biggest barriers in resettlement is housing. I don't know if you've looked at the housing market. It is awful. I actually heard a really great presentation. Part of our work at the Wisconsin Council of Churches is sitting on some statewide committees and teams. And there's a team looking at affordable housing in Wisconsin. And Wisconsin, it is bad. We have a huge housing deficit. We don't, I think we're like 10% behind or something. And we've been behind for years in building housing. And this causes issues. This is why we don't have housing that's affordable for resettlement. And so a lot of times the refugee resettlement agencies have asked and said, do you have any housing? That is the first, like, we know people want to help, but if you could find us housing, then we can actually resettle people. And that's actually what I don't think I said it, but we are unsure, but there may still be people living in hotels too, that they got them off the bases, but they're staying in hotels because there isn't adequate affordable housing. Other questions? Yeah.
Along with the housing, is there any assistance for jobs?
Yeah. So that is also a need, and I know that there are some, and I can't remember, there are some companies who actually made really concerted efforts to say, we want to hire Afghan folks, kind of when this was all in the news. And so, yeah, there is also many of, like, it's kind of some of the people who are coming are very highly educated. We're maybe doctors, which you can't transfer that, which is a struggle. But like highly educated, speak English, able to get a job really easily. And then some people don't speak any English and speak Dari or Pashto. And so that is a whole different barrier. There's also cultural barriers of, in Afghanistan, you could afford for the man to go out and work and the woman to stay home with the children. You can't afford that in America. And so that is a huge cultural barrier too, of like, okay, you have to go out and work. This is not something your family planned on. Yeah. Gotta be on the mic. Or I can repeat, or
How common is it for people who live here and have houses to open their homes to families or individuals?
not super common, just because that's really like complex, of just like that is not a preferred venue, because people, the goal is to settle people permanently, and often opening your home is a more temporary solution. Also, it's just cultural differences of these people, like, oh my gosh, I'm living with someone who speaks a different language, a different religion, a different food. And so I think they've often find it doesn't work very well. Now, if you had an apartment under your house, finish that basement off, that might be different. I know one of the things that they did talk about at LSS that was really interesting is often when they said like Afghan or general refugee resettlement is often families. And there was a huge number of single men that were also resettled. And so they were having to like navigate that to say, what does it mean to like find affordable housing for one person, or maybe do 2 roommates? But then like, these are men who've often like had their moms or their sister or people around to help support them. And now they need to cook and clean and do that. So yeah.
Thank you.
Did you have a question or no?
I was wondering, in the refugee camps, were there, when I think about Afghan society, I think about separation by gender, and I wondered how military and people accommodated that, or whether
Yeah.
people who came over were less committed to it or something like that.
I think it really varied on the people. We worked with, so we did a webinar that's really great on Afghanistan with Janan Najib, who is the founder of the Milwaukee Muslim Women's Association. That woman is amazing. If you want an organization to look at, Janan is doing some really cool work in Milwaukee. And she talked a lot about that, of like, everyone assumes that people are conservative, like not everybody's conservative. And people, like women want to go out and get jobs. And there's so many, like there were a lot of students who came over who were young women who'd been in university in Afghanistan and wanted to continue that work. But that being said, there also were a lot of people who were really traditional. And so the solution they found at Fort McCoy were these women's and children's centers. Afghan men were not allowed in the women's centers. American men could come because they saw the differentiation in that. But this was kind of a safe space for the women to gather, to be separate, to say like, okay, let's build some solidarity, let's support each other, let's have a safe space that's out of our sleeping area. I didn't see the sleeping area, but I think that was kind of like everyone hung up sheets and your family kind of got a little square. And I did see a video, one of the teenagers was like, they were doing knitting. And so they were showing some videos. And so it sounded like, it looked like they had some like sitting areas, but it was probably pretty like by family. But I also know they had an issue of like, they had these women's centers and women had a space. And then all of a sudden they were like, oh, it's January. The men need a space. We need to create some space for them to go have some socialization and kind of a safe space. And so that's when they opened up these like gym soccer spaces that women were allowed in, but I don't think I saw a woman there at all, because it was often men and sometimes children who would hang out there.
I was just curious with respect to disabilities. Now, I understand about trauma, but what in this whole process has been uncovered or discovered with respect to individuals who may be disabled? And if that's the case, what kinds of work is being done around or within that area? Thank you.
I don't know if there's anything like broadly being done, but I know that there were accommodation when they would learn someone had a disability, there would be accommodations made. And so I'm trying to remember, I heard a story of someone who was blind. I think it was a teenager maybe. And so they worked really hard to say, how do we make sure this person is safe, has like supports and that sort of thing. I think there was also in the beginning, kind of once people were settled, once people were at Fort McCoy, they kind of did an assessment and said, okay, who are the people that need to leave first? We're probably people who needed extra accommodation. So I know very early on, I got a call from Becca at Jewish Social Services who said, we have a family who I think someone had some heart issue, like they need to be near UW because of health issues. And can we find housing for them? And that was one of the first people that kind of was removed or got off the base. So I don't know of any full program, but I know accommodations are made. I know with the resettlement agencies, they kind of talk about each family as a case. And so they will, when they kind of get a family, they say, okay, we've got a case. What are the issues in this family? Okay, there's a mom, there's 6 children, there's a dad, there's grandma. What does each person need and how do we help make sure we've built this around there? One of the models that I don't know if JSS, I don't think JSS does it this way, but Lutheran Social Services does is they have churches take on a case and take on a family. And so building kind of this community of volunteers that's around each family that allows kind of that personalized, individualized assistance. So it's not a great answer, but yeah, oh, for sure. Yeah.
Thanks again. Oh, one more.
Get the last one in.
So beyond helping to actually resettle a family or an individual, is there ongoing support once,
That's great.
once the person is there
Yeah.
to educate the greater community about the goings on and the individual who was resettled to continue to assist them in that process? Because you can't just like say, okay, we got you an apartment, here you go.
Oh, yeah, that's great. Yeah. So when a family is resettled, it's a 6-month timeline. That is the goal, that you get supports for 6 months. And so the Refugee Resettlement Agency works really, really closely with you for 6 months. And the goal is that by the end of 6 months, that they are independent, they have jobs, they can drive. And I mean, there's still many things to navigate, and there's still, I'm sure, supports around. But the goal is that that relationship kind of as a heavy support, heavy social service support ends at 6 months. I know that typically then you have another like 3 to 4 years that they will kind of keep an eye on you just to make sure that like that transition has actually been made. So that's what happens with the family. In terms of the wider community, it's a balance, right? You don't want to walk in, like be that person everyone stares at in the end as you walk into a room. Everyone's story is their story. And so I think the goal is some of the organizations like Wisconsin Council of Churches doing these immigration study guides. We've done a ton of webinars. How can we help do that? Are there churches like this very thing to say, you all know a lot more about refugee resettlement than you did an hour ago? And so it's that kind of, how do we continue to create spaces? I think this is a great role for the church. I know the Milwaukee Muslim Women's Coalition has done a lot of this work. There are organizations around the state saying, how do we make sure people are educated in this very broad sense so that then when you encounter someone, the community is already ready. So I do know like up in Wausau, there was a family who was resettled up there, and there was a lot of publicity around it. And that family was very like willing to be in the media, and the lieutenant governor was up there, and like, so it really varies on the family. Some of it has. Yeah, I think so. I mean, I don't know amounts or anything. I know it is better now than it was. I think the part of the issue too is that resettlement agencies kind of get paid after they've taken a family. So which is actually one of the articles I read talked about the power of faith-based refugee resettlement, because with Jewish social services, Lutheran social services, like there is this wider funding, there is this connection to the church and kind of this diversity of stuff that helped keep these programs going when there was no funding because no one was being resettled. Whereas I believe 5-10 years ago, there were a lot more resettlement agencies, but they didn't have that wider support and they closed down because they weren't getting families.
Well, thanks. I forgot to say at the beginning, next week, Jeff Wild, it was Palm Sunday, and Jeff Wild will be back to talk about hymns and how they interact with our faith. I'm messing up the subject matter a little bit, but you make sure and come back. So thanks. Thank you very much, Brianna.